Our next door neighbor that had been living next to us ever since we moved here to Houston, a couple years ago, he passed away. Suddenly, a very unfortunate ailment. I don't know exactly what it was, but it afflicted him, and he went into the hospital and never came back out. And his wife lived there for a couple more years next to us, and she sold the home here recently, so we have new neighbors next door. So Judy and I decided that we would pay them a visit, and we let them know if they were going to be home later in the day, and that we would come by, which we did. I forget whether it was Monday or Tuesday in the evening. I brought them a little welcome gift, and we had said hello, or at least I did, to the gentleman. Walter is his name, a couple of times, but this was kind of the formal welcome and say hello. So very nice couple, very happy to have them in the neighborhood. Now, he knew that I was a pastor. He didn't say that, but the fact that throughout our conversation, we talked about he's a realtor. He never did ask me what I did, because I know he knows. Probably the people he's buying the house, well, you have a neighbor over here, and he's a pastor, and somebody would pass that on. Nothing wrong with that by any means. So he knew what I did, and I suppose he thought the next question would be very appropriate and fit right in, but it was, are you ready for Christmas? After we were talking and chatting for a little while, it took me a little bit by surprise. I think I said, well, I guess so. And I thought, well, I can't leave it there. I said, well, we don't actually keep Christmas in our church. So I said, well, Christmas Day is going to be like pretty much any other day. We might be visiting our grandchildren in Austin. And he said, oh, okay. He never pursued it any further than that. Was probably a little bit surprised, knowing I was a pastor, a minister, and well, of course I am, and all of that. And well, we don't keep it. So a little bit of a surprise for him, but it all went well. It wasn't too awkward, and we went on to other things. I certainly did not, for myself, feel like it was appropriate for me to get into and say, well, Christmas is pagan, and we don't keep that, and launch into that immediately. Because he asked me if I was ready. He didn't say, what's the origin of Christmas? What do you think about Christmas? Or what do you think about Christians keeping it, or anything in depth? It was, am I ready? It was kind of a broad, general question. So I wanted to answer it in a fundamental way, a basic way, and let him determine if he wanted to take it further. Now, let's imagine that he would want to take it further, which he did not. We did not go into that topic thereafter. Their house is beautifully decorated with all kinds of decorations for Christmas, and the tree and the stockings on the mantle and about anything else you can think of. Very beautiful from their standpoint, but we never discussed anything further having to do with that topic. But let's consider that he did, which many do. You probably find this. So when I said, that we don't keep Christmas and etc., like pretty much like any other day, maybe somebody would say, "Oh, why don't you keep it?" That'd be normal. Maybe people would ask further, inquire a little bit further. Nothing wrong with them asking that. I probably would at that point say, well, we observe the holy days or the holidays that are mentioned in the Bible. Probably just leave it there, maybe add a little bit to it, and determine, well, that's the answer. Why don't I? Because we keep the holy days that are listed in the Bible. Those are our observances, and of course the society keeps Christmas. It's a basic answer. And would he want to pursue that any further? Maybe that would say, maybe he'd say, oh, okay. And that's all that he or she is interested in? No, they'll probably leave it there. Well, sometimes people can go on naturally and say, well, don't you recognize the birth of Christ? Well, I would acknowledge that, yes, we do, and feel it a very critical and very important event in our Savior's history and the biblical account. We think that's very, very important, but it's not established as a holy day or a holiday in the Scriptures, so we don't keep it as such. We don't recognize it in the same way we do the biblical holy days. Reasonable, hopefully a reasonable answer to the question that they're pursuing. Maybe he would go on and somebody, well, is there something wrong with Christmas? Well, then you might continue with the answer. I'm not saying this is the perfect way to handle it. I don't do it perfectly, but I'm just showing a progressive based on what they're inquiring. Well, then you respond perhaps in that way. Or you see something wrong with Christmas. Well, Jesus was not really born December 25th. There's a lot of really things that are misleading about that account and that celebration or holy day. And it originally had its roots in non-Christian observance or pagan observance. So yes, in a sense we do. So, as I mentioned, those are not perfect answers. Those probably fit my personality and the way you can answer your way. But I think in a general sense, answer something fundamental. This is whether it's any kind of biblical question. Answer it fundamentally and allow the individual to pursue further if they want to know more, and then you give them more information. I think that's generally the way to handle it. Insulting somebody, I don't think, is the first response when they ask you an honest question like he did. Well, are you ready for it? He wasn't interested in any kind of in-depth conversation about it. Or I don't think in that occasion he needed to be slammed about his own particular beliefs, kind of in his own home in that sense, unless he really wanted the details on it. Well, we should take the time. I just use that as an introduction. When we say we keep the biblical holy days, that makes a statement to somebody automatically. I mean, if you say, well, no, we keep the biblical holy days, you don't have to say a lot more at that point that obviously you think that's superior. Obviously, you're doing the ones coming right from the Bible. And the conclusion is obvious to any thinking person. You think that's better. You think that's more right and correct to do something that you find in the Bible. Well, I think it's worth taking the time every few years, and it's been a few years as I looked back in my notes in speaking on this topic. It's been at least 3 years. I think 2014 I brought something on this subject. I think it's worth every few years to at least address it. I think maybe the split sermon today would fit in, being this particular Sabbath that we're observing here about a week before Christmas, and we'll have the message. I don't know, maybe Mr. Franks will speak on it next week. I don't know. But let's answer a few fundamental things and look at this topic once again. Why are we not keeping this holiday of Christmas, or Easter for that matter? Now, the teens had a Bible study here today. They were talking about the Sabbath and discussed that we're different than everybody else that doesn't observe the Sabbath day. It's certainly different from the ones that keep Sunday. And they were discussing why was that the case. So why are we not keeping Christmas? Well, the fundamental reason probably begins in John chapter 4, verse 23, John 4:23. What's the rationale for why we're not taking note of this day? And after you're in the church for so many years, in many respects, it is different than the first time when you were keeping it and then you stopped. Well, you notice so many things, and after you're in the church for years and maybe decades, you kind of don't even notice, kind of like background music. I came in the hall today, I did not notice that tree until right before I got up here. It just off to the side, thankfully, and your eye doesn't fall on it, and you just don't take particular note. Maybe everybody else did, but it's kind of the way some of it is at this time of year, thankfully. But in John chapter 4, verse 23, the hour comes, now is when the true worshipers. So there is a truthful way to worship, a right way to worship. The true worshipers. Of course, Jesus was talking there to some of the individuals, and they had this lady had an idea about where you go to worship God, Jerusalem or Mount Gerizim, and various views of that. It says, now the true worshipers shall worship the Father in spirit and in truth, for the Father seeks such to worship him. Yes, God wants to be worshiped. It's not for his own gratification, because he just needs that. But he is a jealous God. He does not want attention given to others that belong to him. It's only right and good. No parent would want their children to give affection to some other adult that belongs to them as the parent. And God wants that as well. So he's seeking to be worshiped, has the right to be worshiped. God's a spirit. They that worship him must worship him in sincerity. Well, it doesn't really say that. You can be sincere and it not be in a right spirit and not be in the truth. We worship God in spirit and in truth. What kind of spirit? Matthew 22:37. Matthew 22:37. What kind of worship do we give? Heard part of that in the first message. What kind of worship do we give to God? If we consider ourselves the true worshipers, we wouldn't want to go around and just broadcast that to everybody. Well, I'm one of the true worshipers. Well, I think that's true. We certainly believe that. Doesn't mean everything we do is always godly or perfect. But there are true worshipers or there are not. We think we're part of the true worshipers. Doesn't make us better than other people. As we see here, the key is spirit and truth. So Matthew 22:37, Jesus said unto him, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. So it's a God-first kind of worship. It isn't just Sunday-only worship. God first is a part of the true worship in the right spirit. God first, spirit and attitude, not tradition first. Not family first, not children first, or job first, or wealth first, or anything you could list. God first kind of worship, not tradition, not what others approve. Now, if it's acceptable, like Thanksgiving, 4th of July, Labor Day, Memorial, all of those are fine to recognize and observe. That's not contradicting anything. But what we do is God first. Matthew 15:9. Fundamental principle, of course, well known to us. In vain do they worship me, teaching for doctrines the commandments of men. Men's ideas, men, how they design a worship of God. What they construct it to be. And Jesus said, well, they might be sincere about it, but that's not acceptable. We're not free to do that. Worshiping God according to our own ways. So you worship God in spirit, the spirit of God first, and in truth. Now, there's some things true in the Christmas story that people take note of this time of year, but there's much untruth related to the whole story. I mean, it is a biblical account. Jesus was born, and we'll read some of that here in a bit. So it's right out of the Bible, but even taking that gets distorted. Well, let's start with Santa Claus. Just one reference to this. This is from Healthy Living Publication. And this is what it was in one of the articles. This relates to Santa Claus, which is closely, obviously associated with the Christmas observance and holiday. Now that the holidays are upon us, many children around the world will stand in line for or write a letter to a jolly old man dressed in red, sharing their heart's deepest desires. I remember as a young boy, my mother took me to the downtown department store. That was a big thing, going to the big department store downtown. People got all dressed up for that when I went downtown. And I remember that. I don't know how many Santa Claus I passed I asked her about it. I said, well, how come we saw Santa Claus there and then the Santa Claus is over here too? Another one on the street. Well, they're Santa's helpers. Okay. All I knew at the time. It goes on, the article goes on, but perpetuating the Santa Claus myth may set children up to realize that their parents are liars. Psychologist Christopher Boyle and mental health researcher Kathy McKay argue in a new essay in the medical journal Lancet Psychiatry. The thought of an all-knowing being who watches their every move, maybe with the help from an elf on the shelf, may even terrorize them. Emerging studies do suggest that parents' lies may have a detrimental effect on a child's behavior. A small MIT study on 6- and 7-year-olds found that when an authority figure omits the truth, it may cause children to suspend their trust or be suspicious of anything else that the authority figure says in the future. Well, of course, this was okay to tell you this untruth, this fable about the Santa Claus going all around how he gets all that done in one night, delivering all the toys to everybody. Well, the kids are too young to really figure that all out. But sooner or later they realize that isn't true. They'll not tell me the truth if they think it's best that I not hear the truth and become suspicious. I think we can understand, obviously, that principle and idea. We would not want to rear our children and let them think that we lie to them. We don't tell them the truth. We want them to feel like, yes, we get the truth from mom and dad. It's very important, as it says, authority figures, and that's important for young people and their example. Kind of again reflect on a thought from the first message. Young people, teenagers, when they see adults or baptized adults, and if we're not reflecting what it is that we say we believe in, that bothers them. They think it's hypocritical. And it sometimes can turn them off about the church. Well, we have people professing this on the Sabbath, and that's not what they do. Now, everybody makes mistakes. We need to tell young people and others that as well. But we need to be sincere and honest in what we're trying to profess and what we try to live, and reflect that. So fundamentally, Christmas, or Santa specifically, is not consistent with Christian values. It's not the truth. It wouldn't be what Christian parents would tell their young children. And we don't have the tooth fairy either, or the Easter bunny. Those things are not true. It's not healthy to tell them that. Now, some people would say, okay, that's Santa. That's true. I can see that. But Christmas is primarily about Christ, about the birth of Christ. So what's so bad about that? Why would it be wrong to recognize that? Why wouldn't you join in with everybody else that is thinking of that? Leave Santa out of the whole thing if you want. Well, let's look a little bit at that story. Let me give you a brief overview, because we're not going to wade through every chapter that deals with Christ and his birth and what happened to Mary and Joseph. In the way of a framework, and then we'll look at some specifics, Nazareth was the hometown of Joseph and Mary. In about 5 BC, the Romans required a tax. And so Joseph has to go to Jerusalem because he's of the lineage of David. Now, it would seem to make sense that the Romans would not require this midwinter and put that harsh burden on people and traveling about 80 miles, it would have been, from Nazareth down to Bethlehem. So even then, it wouldn't seem to be midwinter. It's cold and unpleasant, maybe nasty cold rain, and that wouldn't be the time to ask people to do that, most likely. So it's about an 80-mile trip. Jesus is going to, of course, be born in Bethlehem. After he's born on the 8th day, he's circumcised, according to the Scriptures. 40 days after that, remember, he's taken to the temple for the purification requirement, according to the Scriptures. Then there's an offering made for the child. And while they're there, they run into, remember, Simeon and also Anna, a widow, and a prophetess. And they have their comments that they make and so on. You might like to read the story if you haven't in quite a while. Well, about up to a year later, maybe more than a year, there's no way to be precise on this, wise men arrive from the east. After that account, and we'll read a little bit of that, Joseph is told to flee into Egypt to protect the child, baby Jesus, or the young child, not quite an infant, most likely anymore. So they're told to flee into Egypt, and maybe that'd be 40, 50, 60, it depends how far into Egypt they went. At least 40 miles to get within the border and to be safe from Herod. That's their next move. Now, after Herod dies, Joseph has a dream, and it tells in the dream it says it's safe to go back. Herod's dead, who sought to kill the children. But Herod's son took over, and how much confidence would you have in him? Probably not a whole lot. So that brings concern. And God confirms in a dream that it's probably not best to stay right there in Jerusalem around that environment. Who knows what Herod's sons are going to be doing. So they decide to go back to Nazareth. Apparently they stayed after Jesus was born in Bethlehem. Maybe they intended to settle there. Don't know. But now they decide, well, we're not come back from Egypt. I don't think we'll hang around Jerusalem, Bethlehem. We're going back to Nazareth. So Jesus grows up, of course, in Nazareth. Joseph dies sometime between Jesus being age 12 and obviously the beginning of his ministry at about age 30. So that's a little bit of the background. Let's fill in a few details, beginning in Luke chapter 2. Luke chapter 2. It came to pass in those days, this would be verse 1 of Luke chapter 2, there went out a decree from Caesar Augustus so that all the world would be taxed. Mentioned that. Verse 3, they all went to be taxed, everyone into his own city, most likely not in the middle of winter. And Joseph also went up from Galilee out of the city of Nazareth to Judea, into the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and the lineage of David, and some kind of arrangement that's how you were going to have to be registered. So he was to be taxed with Mary, his espoused wife, being great with child. They were pretty far along in her pregnancy. So it was that while they were there, so you do not get the impression, even from the very briefest comments, that here she comes in, Mary is on a donkey, and she's starting labor pains, and they're just getting in town just in time, because there's going to be a birth here in a matter of an hour or two. While they were there, would seem to imply that Joseph and Mary are not irresponsible. If she was not able to make the trip, and he had to, he would have left her. But if she was able to make the trip sometime before this particular moment, well, then they would come down to Bethlehem. They'd be there, which is what it seems to say. While they were there, the days then were accomplished for her full-term pregnancy, that she should obviously be delivered. And she brought forth her firstborn son, wrapped him in swaddling clothes, laid him in a manger, because there was no room for them in the inn. It sounds like, again, the tradition crunches everything into a matter of a few hours, and it wasn't that. It implies that there was no room at the hotel. The hotel was full. Now where are we going to go? Well, there's a barn over there, or a stall, or rather a manger. We'll go there. A manger did not mean a stable. That would not have been exactly what took place. A manger can mean a stall. Look at chapter 13, verse 15. We'll come back to chapter 2. Luke 13, 15. The Lord then answered him and said, "You hypocrite, does not each one of you on the Sabbath loose his ox or his donkey from the stall," same word, "and lead him away to watering?" So often the animals were kept right near the house, right off the house, in a stall, not necessarily in some kind of stable off. away from the house. The word in is the same as what we have in chapter 22. Again, we'll come back to chapter 2, but chapter 22 of Luke, we see this same word translated in, verse 11, Luke 22:11. And you say unto the good master of the house, the master says unto you, where's the guest chamber where I shall eat the Passover? So it was a kind of a guest room. Now, no doubt it was something very, very humble, in humble beginnings, but probably a room, a type of room where you would have normally kept the animals, no question. But then because of all the people coming to town, it was made up. It can be used as kind of a guest area. Very humble, no question, but not necessarily a stable. And they apparently were staying there until the time to deliver the child. Not exactly the scene that you get in the manger scenes that are so popular. Now back in chapter 2, verse 8. Now there were in the country shepherds abiding in the field, keeping watch over their flocks. We've pointed that out, not only us in the church, but that just is not done late December. They wouldn't have been out there in the same way. This is not the middle of winter when this was all happening. Verse 39. Yes, this kind of summarizes, as I mentioned, they went down to Egypt. But in verse 39, when they had performed all things according to the law of the Lord, they returned unto Galilee to their own city, Nazareth. But there's other details, of course, that fit in with that. The child grew and waxed strong in spirit and filled with wisdom. The grace of God was upon him. Well, let's go to Matthew chapter 2. Fill in a couple more things here. Matthew 2. You can get a harmony and go through all the events. I think if you've not done that, it's in the Bible for a reason. Very interesting story, but a lot of confusion about it. Some things difficult to piece together from the Gospels in going back and forth. So Matthew chapter 2, verse 1. Here are these wise men. It doesn't say three. Matthew 2, when Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, behold, there came wise men from the east to Jerusalem, saying, where is he that is born King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east, are come to worship him. Now, I don't think the star was just guiding them, because why would it guide them to Jerusalem? He's not in Jerusalem. So they just assumed they would come to Jerusalem looking for the king, the one that was going to be the king. So the birth had already occurred. How many weeks ago? How many months ago? A year, up to maybe 2? Don't really know. But he's not still in a stable, in a little crib. Seemed to be in a house by this time. Verse 7. Then Herod, when he had privately called the wise men, inquired of them diligently what time the star had originally appeared. Would have taken them quite a while to get there. And I think they did say, yes, verse 2 said, where is he that is born? They knew he was born already. Didn't say, where is he that's going to be born any day now? I think I was in verse 7. Herod then privately called the wise men and inquired of them diligently, what time did you see that star? And he sent them to Bethlehem and said, go and search diligently for the young child, and when you have found him, bring me word again that I may come and worship him also. Well, wasn't that nice? Certainly not sincere there. So Jesus wasn't a newborn any longer, maybe up to close to possibly even 2 years. Probably not quite that old, though. Verse 9, when they heard the king, they departed, and lo, the star, which they had seen in the east and didn't see anymore for a while, the star, which they saw in the east, went before them until they came and stood over where the young child was. Well, now it did lead them. When they saw the star, they rejoiced with exceeding joy. They were very, very glad to see that again. A few more verses, verse 11, and when they were come into the house, they saw the young child. And now they're coming into the house. They see the young child. The Hebrew, or I should say the Greek here, is not the word for a newborn infant. It can imply a younger child. And indeed, it's translated that way. They saw the young child with Mary his mother and fell down and worshipped him. When they had opened their treasures, they presented unto him gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Now, being warned of God in a dream that they should not return to Herod, they departed into their own country now and went a different way. When they were departed, behold, the angel of the Lord appeared unto Joseph in a dream, saying, Arise, take the young child, get to Egypt, be there until I bring you word. Herod's going to seek to destroy the child. There's the warning, go to Egypt, 40 or more miles they would have to travel. So he got up, they took the young child with his mother by night, and they departed to Egypt. He was there until the death of Herod, that it might be fulfilled that was spoken by the prophet, saying, Out of Egypt have I called my son. All the prophecies being fulfilled. Then Herod, when he saw that he was mocked and tricked of these wise men, was exceedingly angry, sent forth and slew all the children that were 2 months old and younger. It seems to be, as he says, 2 years, that there was the anticipation that the child was older than a newborn. 2 years old and under, according to the time when he had diligently inquired of the wise men. So again, you can read the story. Then he goes down to Egypt, and then he's called. It's time to come back, and they go back to Bethlehem. Maybe they were going to settle there. Appears as though they were, and they thought, no, not because of Herod's son. We're going to leave. We're going up north. We're going back to Nazareth, where we were from originally. That seems to be the story. There's many parallels with the Exodus in this account. Jesus is called the second Moses. Moses, a mediator of the old covenant. Jesus, a mediator of the new covenant. Satan tried to kill both the children. Moses escaped. You know that account. We read around Passover. Pharaoh was afraid of the prophecy about a deliverer. He tried to kill the male children. Herod was afraid of the prophecies of the Messiah. He tried to kill, of course, the Christ child. So the account that we find in the Scriptures is not really harmonized with the popular myth, even about Christmas, that comes from the Bible, at least the account of Christ's birth. And then there's always the final point that I'll mention here. Well, why wouldn't we do that? We don't do that because we're not told to observe Christmas. There's a lot of untruths mixed in with the tradition and the holiday. And finally, we can say, well, what's the origin? Why are people doing this? From where does it come? This, I think, is from our own publication on the subject. Quote it, the decision to celebrate December 25th as the day of Jesus' birth was not based on any biblical clues or hints. Historical evidence points instead to it being chosen hundreds of years after Jesus' birth in order to align with the winter solstice. Many ancient sun-worshiping religions celebrated the birthday of their various sun gods on their winter solstice in the northern hemisphere, which happens to be the shortest day of the year. Because from that day the sun began growing in strength again. So they related it to the Son of God and a rebirth. All the rest. Well, it goes all the way back to Babylonian mystery religion and a whole history to that religion and some of these traditions. Many elements of this holiday, including its dates, symbols, and traditions, are rooted in ancient pagan celebrations. That's very true, and that's not something that nobody else can discover. It's in a lot of publications. They even have it sometimes in the newspaper every year. So that's the origin of it. And in order to make it easier for people to embrace mainstream Christianity and the main church that grew after the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th century, well, let's incorporate a lot of things they're already doing. And it'll be easier, more comfortable, so we'll celebrate the birth of Christ right here in the winter solstice. And everybody's happy. Christians like it, the pagans like it. And that's basically what happened. Well, that isn't good enough for the true worshipers. Not better than other people, but if you worship in spirit and truth, that isn't what we would do. Deuteronomy chapter 12, verse 29. 3 more references here today. Deuteronomy chapter 12, verse 29. This is a very quick overview of this topic and concept, because I know we're very familiar with it generally, but still need to rehearse it, hear of it. Certainly our young people as well, at least every few years, because of how prominent it is in our society. Verse 29, Deuteronomy 12, is a principle. Yes, it's the Old Testament, but it's a principle. God is God. He doesn't change. Verse 29 of Deuteronomy chapter 12, when the Lord your God will cut off the nations from before you, where you go to possess them, and you succeed them and dwell in their land, take heed now to yourself that you're not snared by following them after that which they were destroyed from before you, that you're inquiring after their gods, saying, well, how do these people worship? What were their practices? Well, that looks like fun. That looks like we could apply that. Don't do that. That's not what true worshipers do. Borrow this, add that, mix them together. Same principles today. You say, you shall not do that unto the Lord. Well, that would apply as we worship God today in our context in the New Testament. So true worshipers don't celebrate Christmas. I mean, in our own voluntary desire to celebrate that particular holiday, we recognize the birth of Christ. We cannot remove ourselves from everything possible that's related to it, as I'll mention, as we all know. Sometimes there's a party at work, maybe they call it a Christmas party. I don't know if they even do that anymore, but it's an end of the year and you have the cake and the punch, and if you're not being called upon to acknowledge Christmas, not wrong to go to that. Certainly not wrong to decide you won't. Obviously, it's a time for wisdom and good sense in anything we do. Are you going to go to dinner that night at the relatives? Well, are you going to ask me to acknowledge or to say Merry Christmas? Or is this a dinner with the family because everybody's in town? If it's a dinner, I'll go. If it's something else I'm in the midst of, exchanging gifts and singing these hymns or whatever, it'd be better, I just wouldn't be comfortable there. Make a judgment on that. So we pray for wisdom. There's all kinds of circumstances we might find ourselves in. But let's look at 1 Samuel chapter 4 for another principle as we begin to wrap this up. True worshipers do not embrace this holiday as a means by which we're going to worship God. That wouldn't fit with what we're about. Doesn't fit with the Scriptures and the principles that we find there. We don't judge other people or their heart, or we're not trying to condemn them. We don't bring that up and put them down. And we don't do something else as well. In 1 Samuel chapter 4 and verse 6, this is the account of the Philistines, and it has to do with the ark. The very sacred Ark of the Covenant, God himself dwelling in the midst, in the presence of his own people. And they thought, if we have the Ark, nothing can happen to us. And the Philistines thought the same thing. In chapter 4 and verse 6, when the Philistines heard the noise of the shout, they said, what means the noise of this great shout in the camp of the Israelites? What's going on? And they understood that the ark of the Lord had come into the camp, and the Israelites were jumping up and down and excited, and here's the ark, and we're going to win now. And the Philistines were afraid, for they said, God has come into this camp. They said, woe unto us, for there has not been such a thing here before. There's nothing like Israel and their ark and their God. Well, who's going to deliver us, verse 8? Out of the hands of these mighty gods. These are the gods that smote the Egyptians with all the plagues in the wilderness. Be strong and quit yourself like men, O you Philistines, that you be not servants unto the Hebrews, as they have been unto you. Quit yourselves like men and fight. Somebody said, stop it. Act like men. not going to turn and run. So there were those that tried to rally them, and apparently they responded. The Philistines decided, well, it's now or never. Verse 10, the Philistines fought, and Israel was smitten, and they fled every man into his tent. And there was a very great slaughter, for there fell in Israel 30,000 footmen, and the ark of God was taken, and the sons of Eli, Hophni, and Phinehas were killed. Israel could not believe it. Nothing. God would never let that happen. Never let that take place. Well, they made an assumption. God is not just interested in a physical ark. He was interested in what their heart was. So we, in the same way, we recognize the details of Christmas, but we can't just be satisfied, well, we don't keep Christmas, so we're in good with God. Well, that helps. Indeed, that's what we should do, but that's how do we worship God? Okay, we don't do that. What do we do? How do we worship as true worshipers? So just not keeping Christmas or not eating pork, I think we realize, is not all there is to it. Hebrews chapter 6, final verse. Hebrews chapter 6. Doing the right thing and worshiping God on his holy days, not following tradition of people, but there's more to it than we don't keep Christmas. We don't keep Easter. The principle of that is brought out here in chapter 6 of Hebrews. Therefore, leaving the principles of the doctrine of Christ. Okay, we understand Christmas, and if you've kept it like I did, as a part of your life, or it was a part of the church and Christ and the Bible, and you stop keeping it, well, that's a major adjustment. Everything's very prominent, but after years and years after that, well, doesn't have quite the same impact, and it's kind of saying that, leaving therefore the principles of the doctrine of Christ, the fundamental thing, let's go beyond that. So we don't just rehearse every year, well, we don't keep Christmas, we don't keep Christmas, we don't keep Christmas. That's the beginning of what we do. So it's an honor to be a true worshiper. Somebody is. Jesus said, when the true worshipers, it's an honor to be a true worshiper. We don't worship perfectly, don't have perfect truth or understanding or spirit, but we understand that it's more than just not keeping one of the popular holy days. So we need to set the example, not just not doing something, but even set the example of worshiping God in spirit and in truth.